In 1919, the world celebrated peace, but inside the vaults of London, Paris, and New York, a different war had already begun, a financial one. The guns were silent, yet the numbers kept firing. The victors of the First World War demanded reparations. The defeated promised payments, but none of them had the gold. What followed was not recovery, it was reconstruction on credit. And every dollar, pound, and mark issued in the 1920s became a silent weapon aimed at the next generation. The story told in textbooks is simple. The Great Depression, the rise of extremism, another war. But behind that visible history stood an invisible one, the history of debt. Nations owed each other sums that could never be paid, so they refinanced, postponed, and printed. And each time they did, power shifted, not between armies, but between banks. Debt became diplomacy, money became policy, and peace turned into a balance sheet. While politicians talked of rebuilding Europe, central bankers built something else, a global experiment. The Dawes Plan, the Young Plan, the reparations conferences, all were framed as acts of stabilization. In reality, they chained Germany's economy to Wall Street credit and made France and Britain dependent on American loans. It was a triangle of obligation, a perfect illusion of solvency. And like all illusions, it needed belief to survive. But belief is fragile. When the U.S. stock market collapsed in 1929, the debt web snapped. What had been a system of mutual support became a trap. Germany could no longer pay reparations. Britain and France could no longer pay their own debts. Currencies tumbled, reserves vanished, and into that financial vacuum stepped the only institutions still liquid, the central banks themselves. They would now dictate the terms of survival. Few realized it then, but the groundwork for the next global conflict was not laid in the trenches. It was laid in the ledgers. The war that began with rifles ended with receipts. And when the books no longer balanced, nations turned once again to arms. Sometimes peace is not the opposite of war, it is the interval between balance sheets. When the First World War ended, Europe was not rebuilt, it was mortgaged. Every bomb crater was filled with borrowed money. Every bridge rebuilt carried an interest rate. The victors and the defeated shared one invisible bond, debt to America. Between 1919 and 1930, the United States lent more to Europe than any empire had ever invested abroad in history. It wasn't aid, it was leverage. Germany owed 132 billion gold marks in reparations. France and Britain, in turn, owed the U.S. more than $10 billion for wartime loans. The triangle was mathematically absurd. The money had to circulate endlessly to make sense. Germany borrowed from American banks to pay France. France used that to pay Washington. Washington's investors reinvested the funds back into Germany. It was a financial merry-go-round powered by credit, not production. On the surface, the arrangement looked efficient. Industrial output rose, the mark stabilized, and American investors celebrated the, quote, German miracle. But the miracle was synthetic. The factories ran on foreign loans, the profits were used to service old debts. Every dollar of apparent prosperity carried the weight of two future obligations. It was growth without ownership, an economy rented from abroad. This pattern did not emerge by chance. After 1918, the British pound had lost its pre-war supremacy, and London could no longer act as the world's banker. New York quietly assumed that role. The Federal Reserve, only 5 years old, began shaping the post-war world through interest rates and credit lines. The Dawes Plan of 1924, officially designed to stabilize reparations, was in reality a pipeline for U.S. capital to dominate European recovery. Its architects, Charles Dawes, J.P. Morgan's representatives, and a network of private financiers, wrote not only financial agreements but geopolitical dependencies. The global economy became a pyramid of promises. Each nation's solvency depended on the next nation's ability to borrow. Political leaders spoke of peace, bankers spoke of liquidity, and for a few years both languages seemed to describe the same reality. They did not. Underneath, inflation simmered, gold reserves thinned, and governments grew addicted to easy credit. By the late 1920s, half of Germany's short-term obligations could be called in within days, most of them American. One rumor on Wall Street could now destabilize an entire continent. The invisible empire of debt had no borders, only balance sheets. Some historians describe this era as the first experiment in globalized finance, but it was also the first globalized vulnerability. When one link failed, the entire chain would collapse. History teaches balance, credit teaches speed, and when speed outruns balance, collapse is only a matter of time. If this helped you see the structure behind the story, tell me where you're watching from. By 1928, the system had reached its mathematical limit. Too much credit, too little gold, too many promises, too few payments. The illusion of stability depended on constant expansion, on new loans feeding old ones. But credit, like oxygen, becomes toxic when too dense, and the world was about to suffocate. When the U.S. stock market soared, European stability followed its shadow. American capital flooded into foreign bonds, especially German ones, in search of higher returns. Nearly half of Germany's foreign debt came from private U.S. investors, not governments. In Berlin, the Reichsbank knew that prosperity rested on short-term confidence from New York. It was a fragile peace leased by the month. Then came October 1929. The crash was not only a market event, it was a global recall notice. Capital fled Europe overnight. Loans were called in, refinancing stopped, and the invisible threads holding the reparations system together snapped. Germany's foreign reserves evaporated within weeks, banks closed, factories halted, and unemployment reached 6 million. The German miracle was revealed for what it truly was, a house built on borrowed sand. At first, governments tried to negotiate. The Young Plan of 1930 promised relief, but it was already obsolete. The problem was not just the size of the debt, it was its structure. Every creditor was also a debtor. France demanded payment from Germany to service its own debts to the United States. Britain balanced its budget by deferring repayment, and Washington, unwilling to cancel obligations, quietly insisted that debts are sacred. Morality replaced economics. By 1931, the system imploded. Austria's largest bank, Creditanstalt, collapsed, triggering a chain reaction across Europe. Britain was forced off the gold standard, Germany imposed capital controls, and suspended reparations. The world economy entered cardiac arrest. Yet amid the panic, something deeper emerged: distrust. Nations that once traded credit now hoarded gold and fear. The financial alliances of the 1920s dissolved into the protectionism of the 1930s. Each government turned inward, defending its currency as if it were a border. In this atmosphere of collapse, extremist movements found their opportunity. Economic despair became political fuel. In Germany, the promise of recovery without reparations sounded like salvation. And the bankers who had once stabilized the mark now watched as their former clients rebuilt power. This time, not through loans, but through rearmament. What had begun as an accounting problem became a geopolitical one. The financial crisis was not the prelude to war. It was its rehearsal. Because once trust is destroyed, only force remains to settle accounts. How did debt turn peace into conflict? The answer lies in the machinery that few citizens ever saw, the quiet gears of interwar finance. The world didn't collapse simply because it borrowed too much. It collapsed because the structure of borrowing made repayment impossible by design. After 1919, every major economy was tied to the gold standard. Gold was money's anchor, the symbol of credibility. But here was the paradox. To keep currencies stable, central banks needed gold inflows. To earn gold, nations had to export more than they imported. Yet most of Europe was destroyed, while the United States held half the world's gold reserves. In other words, everyone owed, but only one could pay. So the system compensated with paper. American banks, led by J.P. Morgan and Company, lent to Germany. Germany paid reparations to France and Britain. They repaid their war debts to Washington. Then U.S. investors, trusting in the circle, lent again. It was a perfect feedback loop. Until growth slowed. Like an electrical circuit, the system worked only as long as current flowed in one direction. The central banks maintained the illusion of order. The Bank of England defended the pound by raising rates, attracting short-term capital. The Reichsbank followed, draining liquidity at home to keep its mark stable abroad. Monetary discipline became a fetish. Every government promised sound money, even if it meant strangling its own economy. Unemployment was treated as collateral damage in defense of credibility. Meanwhile, Wall Street transformed credit into an export. The 1920s saw the rise of international bond syndicates, private consortia underwriting loans to foreign governments. Each bond carried not only interest, but influence. Bankers attended reparations conferences, drafted fiscal policy, and advised ministries. Sovereignty quietly became conditional. Money dictated the margins of political choice. When the crash came, that web tightened into a noose. Capital controls froze trade, interest payments stopped. And yet, the creditor nations still demanded stability. The logic was self-destructive. To preserve the appearance of solvency, economies were pushed into depression. In Germany, Chancellor Brüning's austerity policies were applauded in London and New York, until they broke the country's social fabric. Mechanically, the transformation was simple. Creditors shifted from financing recovery to defending their own balance sheets. Loans became leverage, then control, then collapse. What began as cooperation turned into financial siege warfare, and the new generals wore suits, not uniforms. This was the true mechanism of interwar economics, a system where debt replaced diplomacy and liquidity replaced trust. Once the flow stopped, all that remained were nations counting losses and enemies. The most dangerous empire is the one built on invisible tribute. By 1932, the numbers no longer matched reality. World trade had fallen by 2/3. Industrial output in Germany and Britain dropped by nearly half. The United States, once the engine of credit, was paralyzed by its own excess. Gold drained from Europe, unemployment soared, and every promise written in the 1920s turned toxic. The global economy, once synchronized by debt, now collapsed in perfect unison. Governments responded with silence first, then with fear. Conferences met, communiques were signed, but no one could agree who owed whom. France wanted its reparations. Germany demanded cancellation. The United States wanted repayment of its war loans. The negotiations resembled a stage play where every actor read a different script. Behind closed doors, central bankers already understood. The system was dead. But public admission meant political suicide. In July 1932, the Lausanne Conference effectively ended reparations. Germany's obligation, once 132 billion marks, was reduced to almost nothing. But it came too late. The damage was not just economic. The faith in international cooperation, in treaties, in collective stability had evaporated. A world built on signatures had discovered that signatures could be erased. The collapse reshaped everything. The British pound's fall shattered the illusion of monetary order. France hoarded gold, deepening deflation. The United States turned inward, retreating into protectionism and tariffs. Capital no longer moved freely. It hid. And into this vacuum stepped ideology. Where loans had once promised unity, new doctrines offered certainty. Fascism in Italy, National Socialism in Germany, militarism in Japan, all fed on the same wound, the betrayal of economic stability. In Germany, the consequences were mathematical. By 1933, industrial output was down 40%. Real wages halved, and over 6 million were unemployed. The middle class, the very people who once bought foreign bonds and believed in progress, was ruined. The promise of work and bread sounded less like propaganda and more like oxygen. The bankers who had designed the interwar structure never intended such a result, yet their equations, once broken, released forces no ledger could contain. Globally, the idea of a free market receded. Nations rearmed not only with weapons, but with tariffs, exchange controls, and state planning. Debt had turned into division. The same financial networks that had once connected London, New York, and Berlin now financed isolation. Each government built its own fortress of currency and industry, preparing for what they no longer called war, but expected all the same. And the ultimate irony, the gold that was supposed to unite nations became the very metal they fought to seize. Banks counted bars, armies crossed borders. The economic order that promised peace had delivered its opposite. When money ceases to connect people, it begins to separate them. If this brought a new angle to familiar history, tell me where you're watching from. It would be comforting to think that the debt war ended in 1945, that the ruins, the trials, the new institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, closed the chapter. But systems don't end, they evolve. And the same mechanisms that linked Berlin to Wall Street in 1928 now connect entire continents through invisible lines of credit. After World War II, the new order was built to avoid the old mistakes. Fixed exchange rates under Bretton Woods, the dollar tied to gold, the promise of balance and control. But within 25 years, it happened again. Too many dollars, not enough gold. Too many promises, too few reserves. In 1971, Nixon closed the gold window, ending the last restraint on global credit. The anchor was gone. Money became pure confidence, a symbol without substance, a claim without collateral. Debt, once national, became planetary. Banks turned into intermediaries of belief. The same logic returned in a digital form. Lend, refinance, inflate, repeat. In the 1920s, it was the Dawes Plan. In the 2010s, it was quantitative easing. Then it was called reparations and reconstruction. Now it's called stimulus and recovery. The vocabulary changed, but the function stayed. Debt as growth, liquidity as peace. And once again, imbalance became stability's price. Just as Germany in 1928 depended on U.S. credit, today entire economies depend on central bank liquidity. The flow must not stop. When it slows, crisis. When it reverses, collapse. Every market crash in the past 2 decades has been answered by a flood of new money. The invisible empire survives not through conquest, but through expansion. Credit replaces gold. Algorithms replace signatures. The faces are new, the pattern is ancient, and the moral geometry remains the same. After 1929, the debt pyramid fell because confidence evaporated. After 2008, the pyramid was saved because confidence was manufactured. Trillions appeared with a keystroke, not a treaty. Governments no longer borrow from bankers. They are the bankers. The Federal Reserve, the ECB, the Bank of Japan, each now performs the function that private lenders once held: perpetual refinancing of a fragile peace. The lesson is uncomfortable. Every age believes its system is smarter than the last. Every age forgets that debt is not wealth. It is a claim on the future. The more we expand it, the narrower that future becomes. The interwar world discovered this too late. Our world may discover it again. History didn't repeat, it simply changed the software. The First World War ended in 1918, but in truth it never ended at all. It just changed form. Where trenches once divided nations, ledgers did. Where artillery once shattered economies, Interest rates did. The age of empires gave way to the empire of debt, quieter, smoother, but no less absolute. Every generation inherits the same illusion that numbers can control destiny, that if the books balance, the world will too. Yet every century proves the opposite. Debt does not disappear, it migrates. From kings to governments, from governments to markets, from markets to central banks. Always upward, always invisible, until someone, somewhere, stops believing. In 1931, disbelief spread like contagion and destroyed a system. In 2008, disbelief returned and almost did the same. Each time, the response was identical: print more, lend more, promise more. Each rescue became the seed of the next collapse, because the problem was never liquidity, it was trust. And trust cannot be printed. Perhaps that is the real legacy of the hidden debt war. Not the crash, not the treaties, but the idea that peace itself depends on perpetual credit. The machine must run, or the silence begins again. It's a fragile bargain between nations, between generations, between what we earn and what we owe. History doesn't repeat. It waits. It waits for belief to return, for promises to grow faster than memory, for the next crisis to be called by a gentler name. And when it comes, it won't announce itself with smoke and sirens. It will arrive in numbers, quiet, rational, inevitable. Because wars don't always start with gunfire. Sometimes they start with interest rates.